Court is in session. Gentlemen, we're here today to inspect the events that resulted in the death of Lenny Small. The defendant, George Milton, stands accused of the first-degree murder. Prosecution, you may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we are here to discuss a tragic event that took place on the banks of the Salinas River on the 8th of August, 1935. Lenny Smalls, a man with the mind of a child, was shot in the back of the head by his friend, George Milton. This was not an act of mercy. It was cold-blooded murder.
Everyone but the jury may be seated. Mr. Gevorg, please swear in the jury. Members of the jury, your jury today will be to determine whether the defendant is guilty or not guilty, based only on the facts and evidence provided in this case. The prosecution must prove that a crime was committed and that the defendant is the person who committed the crime. However, if you are not satisfied with the defendant's guilt to that extent, reasonable doubt exists and the defendant must be found not guilty. Mr. Gevorg, what is today's case?
Your Honor, today's case is if George was right in murdering his friend Lenny.
Is the prosecution ready?
Yes, Your Honor.
Is the defense ready?
Yes, Your Honor.
I will call my first witness, Curly. Curly, can you tell us what happened on the day of the incident?
That big bastard killed my wife. He didn't care about nobody. He was a danger to everybody. He deserved to die like a pig.
And what did you do when you found out, Mr. Curly?
I should have killed that son of a gun. He deserved to die for what he did.
Thank you, Curly. No more further questions.
Your Honor, I would now like to call the ranch workers as my next witness, Candy and Slim, once again, to examine the character of Lenny Small as described by those who knew him.
George was torn apart. He cared for Lenny like a brother. He knew what Lenny was capable of, and he was scared for him. His actions say it all for him.
And what do you believe George's intentions were when he shot Lenny?
It was an act of mercy. He didn't want Lenny to suffer at all at the hands of the mob.
All right, thank you, Slim. No further questions.
I would like to call my next witness, Candy. Candy, I would like to know, what did you witness on the day of the incident? When I told George to have Lenny run away, I didn't think he really would have killed him. The next thing I saw was him lying dead on the ground before coming here. Thank you, Candy. No more further questions.
I would now like to call George to the stand. George, can you describe what happened on that day?
I had to make a choice. Lenny didn't understand what he was doing. He was scared, and I knew the mob was coming for him. I couldn't let him suffer.
So you believe your actions were justified?
I did it to protect him. I loved him like a brother. I thought it was the right thing to do at the time.
All right. Thank you, George. No further questions.
Ladies and gentlemen, this was a murder. George Milton took his friend's life in cold blood. He betrayed their friendship in a moment of despair. Look at this man. He was vulnerable and innocent, but George, he chose to end his life instead of seeking help.
Your Honor, I would like to remind the court of the bond between George and Lenny. Their friendship was built in trust and care. George clearly shows himself being father-like towards Lenny's mistakes. George's decision, while tragic, was made in a moment of desperation to protect Lenny from suffering. This act of desperation and support all along is not something a murderer would do. And the mob was coming. George knew what they would do to Lenny. This wasn't a cold-blooded murder. It was a tragic act of compassion. Remember that George was trembling and hesitating while making the decision to kill or not. Order. Thank you, gentlemen, for bringing forth your evidence. The court will now take a brief recess before the jury deliberates. Court is back in session. I appreciate everyone's patience during the deliberation process. I would like to hear from both attorneys for the last time before we proceed to the verdict. Mr. Gevorg, is there another evidence or witness you would like to propose?
Your Honor, with your kind permission, I would like to call another witness to the stand, and his name is Crooks. Crooks, you were on the ranch with both George and Lenny. Can you please describe their relationship? I'll admit, they were close. George always looked out for Lenny. But that don't change nothing about what happened after that. I knew Lenny was in danger from the others, but George sure enough killed him. And do you believe George had different options? Maybe. But he didn't see him. He was scared. Thank you, Crooks. No more further questions.
Your Honor, I would now like to call the ranch workers as my next witness, Candy and Slim, once again, to examine the character of Lenny Small as described by those who knew him. Candy, can you tell us about Lenny's nature?
Lenny was a quiet fella. He ain't have no mean bone in his body. He just liked to tend the rabbits and was just like a child.
And Slim, what do you have to say about George's decision?
George was placed in a difficult situation. He loved Lenny like a brother. He didn't want him to suffer. I could tell by how different George's voice was after he killed Lenny. His close friend, his brother almost. He was acting all weird when we were trying to drink with him.
So you believe George acted out of love and sympathy?
Yes, he did what he thought was best for Lenny. I even told him that he had to do it to his face.
It seems that we are beginning to view this case in another perspective. The actions of George Milton are being acknowledged differently, one of compassion rather than malice. Mr. Gevorg, do you have any rebuttal to this emerging viewpoint?
Your Honor, I know this incident is emotionally overwhelming for the defendant, but we cannot discard the issue of a life being taken. The responsibility of George was towards the protection and escape for Lenny's life, but not to have it taken, according to Candy himself.
Indeed, and I raise this, but we still have to look at in context. The fear of being taken by a mob with the possibility of brutal injury are huge factors. Ladies and gentlemen, I urge you to consider the moral implications of George's actions. Was it truly murder, or was it a desperate act to save a friend from a fate worse than death? Your Honor, I would like to remind the court of the bond between George and Lenny. Their friendship was built in trust and care. George clearly shows himself being father-like towards Lenny's mistakes. George's decision, while tragic, was made in a moment of desperation to protect Lenny from suffering. This act of desperation and support all along is not something a murderer would do. Remember, the law does not exist in a vacuum. It is our duty to consider the humane element in this case, which would be the so-called right decision. George Milton, you are not just a defendant. You are a man who faced an unimaginable choice. The jury must weigh the evidence and the moral implications of your actions. Court is back in session. I appreciate everyone's patience during the deliberation process. I would like to hear from both attorneys for the last time before we proceed to the verdict.
Your Honor, though I believe a life was taken, I'm aware of the complexities of this case. The emotional burden that George's actions had is not to be dismissed so easily. However, the law and consequences of justifying such an action should be held.
Your Honor, I believe that the evidence has shown that George's actions were based on love and desperation. He was set before an impossible decision, and his actions were those of a man trying to save his friend from the most horrific of fates, not those of a cold-blooded murderer. Besides, Lenny did listen to George's instructions to stay and technically gave himself up in a voluntary manner. He was going to die at some point anyways. Thank you both. Clearly, this has been a case stirring the emotions, but one raising very relevant questions as to morality, friendship, and the human condition. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you listened to the evidence given and the arguments put forward. You are now charged with the responsibility to deliver your verdict in determining whether George Milton committed cold-blooded murder or his actions were justified based on the events as presented to him. George Milton, the jury has found you not guilty of the charges against you. The court finds that your actions, though tragic, were in a moment of desperation to save your friend from a more brutal fate at the hands of a mob. You will also be free of the sentences due to the special circumstances and conditions that you were given in this case, considering this is a consensual murder proven by evidence. Court is adjourned.